Welcome to the Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. My name is Krista Copper, the host and creator of this podcast. I am a musician who loves theater. I love playing for theater so much. And so I decided to start a podcast that talked to people who work behind the scenes of theater. So people who stage manage and music direct and are sound engineers and designers and work in the costume shop. I think it's so fascinating, all of the jobs and all of the worlds that come together in order to make live theater happen. And so I've learned a lot from doing this podcast and talking and sitting down and talking with people, and I hope that it's beneficial to you as well. As I'm recording this, it's December, so the holiday season is really busy for musicians, which I love. And I've had two gigs I kind of wanted to talk about. One of them is I was playing in a performance of The Nutcracker, which every time I play for ballet, I think I don't get to do this enough. I love playing with dancers. The relationship between movement and music, I think, is just wonderful. And so I'm playing the show of The Nutcracker, and there's a scene where our cue to start playing is for the dancers to walk on stage. Once they walk on stage, we start playing. The problem came in is that these dancers in this particular scene are like 7, so they're very young. They're super cute, very young, and so naturally they're nervous to walk on stage, right? And I think who isn't nervous to walk on stage, but especially when you're 7 and there's hundreds of people watching you. It takes so much courage to do that. And so there's girls on both sides of the stage. From where I'm standing, I can see into one wing. And the conductor is standing there. He's got his arms up. He's waiting for these cute little girls to walk on stage, and they're not coming. And I can see from one edge, they're waiting for the other side to walk on first, right? Because there's that fear of, what if I walk out on stage and no one follows me, right? Like, what if I'm the only one? And so we're waiting, and it's like, the seconds feel very, very long while it's like silent. We're waiting for these little girls to walk on stage. And I thought, man, there's a life lesson in there somewhere. Like, it's scary. It's scary to be the first one to walk on stage. And it's scary thinking, like, what if no one's got my back, right? What if I'm the only one? And what if I'm wrong? And like, that fear, I think, is contagious. At another gig, it was just a train wreck, one of the biggest train wreck gigs I've ever been a part of. The music director quit a week before tech rehearsals were going to start. There was a pit of like 6 of us, I think, and at least 4 of us were at least 15 minutes late to every rehearsal. We were on stage, and so our dress was all black, which is typical for musicians. We're 99% of the time we wear all black. One of the gals would always show up in like this white glittery blazer. And I was like, no, everyone else is wearing all black. Why are you wearing this white blazer? Like, you stick out. 99% of the time musicians wear all black. Like, what are you doing? The stage manager, was really impatient about everything. I had a question about something, and I was afraid to ask her, because I was like, I don't want her to yell at me, because she's just impatient with everything. It was one of those gigs where you're sitting in tech rehearsals and you're like, how is this going to come together? And eventually it did. I mean, the shows happened, and thank goodness it's over, but I was just like, how is this going to happen? Another really frustrating thing about the gig is that people complained a lot in the green room. With both of these gigs, I was struck by how contagious the things that we do are. As human beings, we feed off of each other a lot more than I think we realize. So like, in the instance of those little girls, they were all afraid, like that fear of walking out on stage was contagious, right? Like, they could feel that the other girls were also nervous about going out on stage and performing. And so that fear, I think, spread through them, because they had rehearsed it fine, several times. And then with this other gig, that complaining was contagious, and being late to rehearsal was contagious, and not showing up prepared. I think what we put out is contagious, whether it's good or bad. On the later gig that I was describing, the new music director that they got after the previous one quit, he was amazing. He put out such great energy, and he was always very positive, and he made jokes, and you could tell that it was very intentional. And I was so struck by the contrast between his behavior and his devotion to his professionalism and putting on a good show, and the general attitudes of some of the other players in the pit. I would encourage you in whatever capacity you're working in, and I think when you're in the arts, it's a job, and sometimes you're just in situations that are rough, and people don't get along, and sometimes people can be hard to work with. It's easy to let yourself kind of get bogged down in that and to make compromises of. I remember one rehearsal I was going to be running just a little bit behind, and I remember thinking like, oh, it doesn't matter because no one else will be on time. But then I was like, wait a minute, no, like don't compromise your professionalism and your devotion to being on time because other people are not. Like, you can't let yourself be influenced by that. And so I would encourage you, however you're working, to be aware of the things that you're putting out. If it's easy once one person starts complaining to jump on that train, and it's easy once one person fudges on maybe like a safety rule or something, that for you to not care as much about safety too, but put out good things. Because like I said, I think how we approach things, and especially in an art as collaborative as theater, there's so much back and forth that happens between people, and so many things that we pick up on that other people are doing. And I would encourage you to put out things that are good and put out things that are positive. And if people are sitting around in the green room complaining, like, find good things to talk about, right? Like, find ways to compliment people, find ways to point out the good that's happening in the production. But yeah, those are my two gig stories, which I've been thinking a lot about. So wanted to share that. Today is my conversation with Megan Culley. Megan is a New York City-based sound designer and composer. I love talking to sound people. I love talking to everyone who comes on the show. But as a musician, I also am in like the sound, like aural world. And so it's fun for me to talk to people who are also in the aural side of theater, but in a different capacity. And the overlap and the differences between those two worlds, I think, is fun to explore. So Megan's great. I'm grateful that she sat down and took the time to talk to me. So here we go. Here's my conversation with Megan Culley. All right, so let's start with your background, where you grew up, training or schooling you received, and where you are now and what you're doing.
Cool. So I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I went to both undergrad and grad at Ohio University, but my undergrad was in speech language pathology. And I sort of just like, as I was finishing undergrad, I realized it wasn't really what I wanted to do every day. Like, I have an absolute passion for speech pathology, and it's kind of like a family thing. My mom is a speech language pathologist. My sister is in the field as well. I just realized that I was being pulled in a different direction, that I didn't really know what direction. But my mom and sister kind of pushed me towards sound design. My one sister is a musical theater major, and she was like, "You're a musician and you've been passionate about theater for forever. Why not look into this?" And I ended up applying for OU's grad program and then staying for a full 3-year MFA.
Nice. What do you think initially drew you into theater?
I mean, I've been seeing theater since I was old enough to sit, basically. And, I grew up in Cleveland, where we have the second largest theater district in the country besides New York. The thing that drew me into it was the stories and the way that we could portray different people on stage. And, I was always a huge fan of musicals. And then once I started working in sound design, I found a passion for plays as well.
Mm-hmm. And you said you're a musician. What instruments do you play?
A whole bunch of them. I'm sure I'll forget a few, but like guitar is my main instrument, and then I sort of dabble in like keyboard, mandolin, ukulele, some percussion stuff. What else? I occasionally play bass guitar, whatever I can pretty much get my hands on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. I'm a musician as well. I'm a bass player, so I love talking to
Oh, nice.
musicians too. So then after you got your master's degree, where did you go after that?
Pretty much I moved to New York a couple months afterwards, and I haven't left since then. I've been working in the New
Uh-huh.
York market and then occasionally traveling out to do like regional and local stuff.
Was there anything surprising about transitioning from Ohio to New York City?
I'd been here a lot of times, so like the actual city itself wasn't surprising, but the surprising thing about the theater community is how small it is. Like I would never have thought that I would see the same people at a lot of gigs, but it's a very tight knit small community, and you get to really know a lot of people.
Yeah, I would not expect that from New York City at all. How did you get your first few gigs when you moved to the city?
Well, the first gig that I got was a board opping gig at MCC. I had a friend who was a production manager, and they were looking for a board op, and she messaged me and was like, "Hey, this might be a good foot in the door for you." So basically, I took this board opping gig that was like 2 weeks of tech, and then I think 5 or 6 weeks of performances, and it just kind of got me into the world of what off Broadway sound looks like, which is very different than anything I learned in grad school. And then from that point, I sort of started answering ads on like Playbill or offstage jobs and that kind of thing, and just taking really low paying small designs. But the good thing about that was I met a whole lot of people who were in the same boat as me. And a lot of those people are kind of ascending at the same level that I am. So I have all of these friendships of people that I've been working with for years on different shows.
I've moved to like different cities too, and that's just like that's the biggest thing is just being around and like taking those really small, low-paying jobs and just like slowly working your way up. It takes so much time.
Yeah, it's kind of soul crushing sometimes, but like if you're really focused on your goal, it makes it a little easier.
You mentioned off Broadway sound being different. How is it different than what you had worked in the past?
Well, for one thing, there's a lot of equipment that I hadn't really seen before. And putting together an off Broadway sound system was very different than anything that I'd done at like summer stock or at school, because we just didn't really have the resources. So we had a very basic system in all of those places. And then I got to New York and I was like, I don't know what half of this stuff is. So there was just a big learning curve when I came into that world. And I've done a few assisting gigs and I'm still learning a lot of it, but it's very different.
So the systems that like off Broadway and Broadway theaters use, are they all pretty similar, or does it differ from theater to theater?
Well, I haven't really worked on Broadway at all, but
Hmm.
as for off Broadway, there's a lot of things that are similar, and then there's a lot of things that are custom depending on one, who the associate is and their preference, and also like the demands of the show. And some shows have microphones that are to pick up actors on stage, and not necessarily wireless mics, but like stage mics or choir mics. And then sometimes there's a lot of practicals involved, so like small speakers hidden throughout the set or that kind of thing. It really just depends on the needs of the show.
Hmm. Take us through the process of when you're asked to be a sound designer for a show. What are the next steps, and then how do you get to opening night?
Yes. Okay. So basically, my first thing that I do is I read the script without thinking about design at all. And it sort of just lets me get a taste for the story and the characters. And then I read it again and try to get more of the dramaturgical questions answered. Because I think that design and dramaturgy go hand in hand, and you won't have as successful of a design if you don't do the dramaturgical work. So after the second time, I generally start to put together research. Sometimes I'll make a playlist of the music that I feel could be used as inspiration for the show, or like different sound textures. And I'll put together like a preliminary cue sheet. So basically, I can talk to the director using that as a basis. And then we talk through pretty much the whole show, usually, if I get my way. And then I start making sounds and throwing everything I can at the wall and seeing what the director feels could potentially be successful. And then, I try to have as many sounds done before rehearsal starts as possible when I'm able to. I'm generally designing 5 or 6 shows at a time, so sometimes that doesn't happen. But I like to go into tech with around 90% of the sound ready to go. And then the rest of it I can build in the room as things change, because they always change in the room. And then through tech and opening.
So most of the sounds that you're using, are you building from scratch? Are you pulling from like online resources? Are they? Is it just where are you finding most of your sounds?
I try to make as many as I possibly can, but there's some things that I just can't really make. So I use a bunch of different websites. Like there's one called like a sound effect, and then there's a bunch of different places like 99 Sounds that give away free packs. And sometimes I'll go into those packs and I'll kind of twist them to be my own sort of thing that works for whatever show I'm doing.
What's the weirdest thing you've done to create a sound?
I did a show about whales a few years ago, and I like put a plastic bag around a microphone, filled up my bathtub, and sort of made underwater sounds.
I love it. Did your microphone survive?
It did, yeah. I
Good.
really wrapped it tight. So,
Yeah. I'm glad to hear it.
yeah, the sounds weren't as good as I wanted them to be, but it was a fun process.
Sure. Do you ever get frustrated or stuck? And what do you do when that happens?
I get frustrated on a semi regular basis. It really depends on the show. I've had a few frustrating ones this fall, and if it's a musical, I kind of try to take a step back and listen for a minute instead of trying to solve things, and it lets me calm down and get my head refocused. If I'm stuck on a play during a 10, I'll maybe go outside and I'll listen to something on my phone, like through Spotify, and just get my brain working in a different way. So it's just keeping it varied and keeping myself from getting pigeonholed into one thing.
When I've prepared for recitals in the past, I've had a lot of professors and a lot of colleagues suggest like when you're like preparing for a recital or you're feeling burned out on a show, just to like stop listening to music completely. Like don't listen to the radio, like turn it off in your car. Don't use it as background noise, just to kind of do something different. And so your ears can kind of like detox a little bit so that you can go back into the theater or the concert hall and you're fresh. And so I like to hear how people who are in the sound world, keep their ears fresh and engaged, because it's your ears kind of like they get tired.
Oh,
They
yeah.
get tired of hearing sound.
Yeah, it's fatigue is a real thing. And especially like in a setting where we're hearing a lot of loud sound, getting out of that for a few minutes can be incredibly beneficial, both for like our emotional and creative health, but as well as our actual auditory health. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I'll step outside for the whole break and I'll just stand out there and listen to the world and remind myself that it's a show, it's going to happen, reset my ears, and then go back in.
I had a sound engineer friend who would frequently walk around with like noise canceling earbuds in, and so you'd go up to try to talk to him, and he couldn't hear you, because it was just. I was like, I love that.
It's taking care of his ears.
Yeah, and getting like introvert time at the same time.
Yeah, that's awesome.
What are some of the differences between designing sound for a show, like I mean, a straight play versus a musical?
There's some similarities, but there's a lot of big differences. The main difference is that for a musical, you're generally designing reinforcement. So you're taking live sources like a band and actors singing, and you're reinforcing those into the space so that every single person can hear the story and get the full effect. Of course, there's some effect work and soundscapes and that sort of thing, but it really just depends on the musical. And then for plays, sound designers have a whole lot of freedom. Like, for example, I do a lot of composition for plays. It's actually my favorite thing to do in my profession. And as well as composing, you can have soundscapes and effects, and you can use microphones for things other than reinforcement, like putting a weird effect on something. There's also like the reinforcement of that in the off Broadway and Broadway world, where we just have to make sure that everyone hears it. So they're very different jobs, but they have a lot of overlap.
So it sounds like are you more involved when it's just a straight play? Like is there more for you to do usually?
There's a lot to do in both instances. It kind of just changes when I do it. So for a
Hmm.
musical, I'll design the system, get everything ready, get the rental ready and everything, and then I don't really have much to do until tech. And tech is when I shape the voices, shape the band, and design what the sound is for the show. Where for a play, I'll generally do a lot of my work before I'm even in the theater. And then when I'm in the theater, I program a lot of stuff and I, put it in different speakers and make it swirl around the audience or whatever I'm doing. So there's some stuff to do in tech, but the majority of the work that I do for play is before tech.
What are some of the challenges of doing sound with a band?
Well, so there's a lot that goes into monitor mixes and making sure that they can hear everything that they need to hear. And musicians are very, I don't want to say picky, but sure of what they want to hear,
Mm-hmm.
and what they need to hear. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. And then there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that their level doesn't compete with the voices that are going through the system. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of balancing. It's a lot of EQing and compression and all that sort of thing to shape it.
How do you handle conflict?
I try my hardest to understand what the other person is saying, see if I can do anything to help them. And if I can't, then I explain my side of things and kind of just let it be. I try to avoid conflict at all costs because I don't like the way that it creates a negative vibe in the room.
Mm-hmm.
I'll generally go out of my way to try to help someone else unless it's at the detriment of my own department.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of instances, like as a musician, like standing in the pit, you get to observe and watch a lot of things happen and a lot of things come together and you get to see a lot of the conflict that goes on. And it's always interesting to see how either the sound engineer or the sound designer handles when actors are upset because they can't hear on stage or the band is mad because their monitors keep getting turned down, because it's interfering with the overall sound. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
I think there can be a lot of conflict that comes up around sound because everyone needs to hear, right? Like that's one of the most
Right.
important parts of being in the show is being able to hear.
Yeah, part of it is saying, "Oh, well, if the actors can't hear, that's a serious problem." So, sometimes I won't take full notes from the actors of like, I think that should be louder, but I'll listen to the heart of what they're saying and see if it's something that I need to change.
Love that. So let's talk about composition. How do you just compose when you have a show coming up? Do you compose like do you have a scheduled time that you compose every day? What is do you have like a composing routine? What does that look like for you?
Generally, when I'm composing for a show, it all just starts with research, and I go into a lot of existing music and see what grabs me, and then sort of create those textures in my own way. I'll look at something that's successful and be like, why is that successful? How does that apply to what I'm doing? I generally only compose for shows because I just don't have time to do stuff for fun with my
Mm-hmm.
schedule. But, in the next month or so, December and January are pretty dead overall. So I'm trying to take that time to just create for fun. I do a lot of my work from my apartment. So I have like my bedroom is also my office, and I've managed to have like a pretty big workspace in there. So I have like a few keyboards, giant monitor, giant computer, monitor speakers, and a bunch of instruments. So I generally compose using MIDI keyboards because it is just faster to change. But when I can, I try to record real instruments.
Nice. Do you have any favorite places for inspiration that you go when you're composing?
So I'm a huge film score nerd, and
Yes.
generally I'll go to scores over music that has lyrics because it tells a story without words.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm usually trying to do. I'm usually writing transitions or underscoring, and there's not really words that are involved in that usually. So right now I'm obsessed with the Mandalorian score by Ludwig Göransson, and so that's kind of pervading all of my research at the moment.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I remember way back when I first started as a musician, and I started to really hear the music in movies, discovering like John Williams and just
Hmm.
being like blown away of like how music shaped so many of his films, like, and then Howard Shore and
Yes,
so good.
so many amazing, amazing composers. Not nearly enough women getting the big gigs, but I think that tide will change soon.
I think it will too. I think so. I think people talking about it is really going to be beneficial. Like just like, hey, this is happening, and I think a lot of the problems have been maybe people not realizing that this is going on, and this is the way it's always been. But I think more and more discussions, I think that's really going to help change the culture around women in this profession.
Absolutely.
Have you ever felt like you've been discriminated against as a female?
Not really when it comes to design, but definitely when it comes to engineering and technical work.
Mm,
I don't really take many tech gigs anymore, but when I first moved here, I made a lot of my living off of that. And generally, I would be the only woman on the sound crew. And, some guys were awesome, and some guys basically looked at me and said, "Why are you here?" Like,
mm,
didn't physically say that, but I felt that vibe. So I would have to prove myself in like the first 10 minutes of a call. And sometimes
mhm.
that would be like, maybe doing something I wasn't super comfortable with because I wouldn't want them to discount me as a technician. It's a hard way to work.
Yeah, I've too walked into situations where you can just kind of tell from the vibe
Mhm.
of like, okay, like I have to prove myself here.
Yeah, they're not thinking, "Oh, she's in the room for a reason." They're thinking, "Why is she in this room?"
Hmm. Yeah, it will change. I believe that it will change.
I hope so. I think it's happening now. I've worked at some places where we have an entire female team, and it's awesome.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
I've sometimes thought like the day that I walk into a pit and it's all females, like then I can retire,
yeah, that'd be amazing.
Yeah. I don't know if I've ever been in a pit with all, like, even with the majority females. It's usually like me and like maybe one other person, maybe two, but not
Hmm.
even the majority. So it'll be interesting to see
Yeah,
how that changes, the next decade or two.
for sure.
So let's switch gears a little bit. So you've said that you've done like tech work. Explain the structure of the sound team from the technical side.
Yeah, so generally, I'm going to go with like off Broadway as an example. So generally,
Mm-hmm.
you have the designer, the associate, maybe an assistant, and they really take care of like all the pre production and getting the rental and the system together. And then in a theater, you'll have an audio supervisor who kind of runs the load in and runs it all the way through the closing, basically. So they make sure that all the equipment is appropriate for the space and safe, and then they hire in crew, determine how much time they need, and are there to fix any problems that come up during the load in. And then generally you have like a sound engineer who on a musical would be like the person who's mixing the show, or depending on what level you are, that may be a different person from the A1. You just basically have different areas that you work in, and everyone tries to get the job done as quickly and safely as possible.
Within that like technical side of sound, do you have a favorite job that you like to do?
I mean, I really enjoy labeling cables. Like, that's not really the technical thing, but it's really satisfying. So, like, I'm happy to be sat at a table for a few hours with a giant stack of cables and a bunch of labels and a bunch of tape.
I was not expecting that. I love that answer.
It's so fun. Like, generally that happens in shop prep, but sometimes it happens in the theater, depending on if your management gave you time for shop prep or not.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of respect for the sound team. They go usually some of the first people at the theater, usually some of the last people to leave at the end of the night,
Hmm.
and usually the ones that get the most heat from like audience members, like it's too loud. And I just, so much respect for people in sound.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing with the Tonys of years ago was like, we don't know how to judge sound, but that's a lie. Everyone knows how to judge sound because they know when it's bad,
Hmm.
and they are not afraid to
Yeah,
tell you.
for sure. Someone else I'd interviewed had said, when you're dealing with sound, it's never like an opinion. Like people don't say like, "Oh, I think it's too loud." It's
Mhm.
always a fact, like it's too loud.
Yes, agreed.
Whereas like in other designs, like people don't say like that tree and that scenery is too green. Like
Mhm.
people don't have that strong of opinions as they do on sound. So it's a
Yeah.
hard job.
And I think part of that is that we have so much access to audio nowadays. Like everyone walks around with headphones and people have stereos at home, and they think that that entitles them to know exactly how a show should sound.
If there's one show that you haven't designed yet that you are dying to design for, what show would that be?
I really want to do a production of The Crucible someday. It's like
Oh,
one of the
nice.
first plays I ever read in high school, and it just, there's so many options for it. Like, I kind of want to do a version of The Crucible that has the aesthetic of American Horror Story Coven. Like, that would be really fun to compose for. And I know, like, the
Hmm.
show has some problematic stuff in it, but I still think it's a great show.
What about for musical?
I mean, I've designed like a fair few of my favorite ones. My favorite musical is probably Evita, which I haven't done, or Jesus Christ Superstar is another one that I really love and I have done. So I guess
Hmm.
Evita? I don't know.
What's one thing that you wish you would have known before you moved to New York City?
I wish I would have known to take care of myself because
Hmm.
the first year and a half that I was here, I was working hundreds of hours a week, like crazy amounts, and not eating well, not drinking water, not taking care of myself, not giving myself the time to sleep. And it just wreaked havoc on everything. So I think that's like the thing that's most important that I tell young designers is yes, pursue your dream, but take care of yourself while doing it.
Do you have any, besides like what you just said, like drinking water and eating well and sleeping, do you have any other routines that you either do daily or weekly or monthly to help yourself recharge and survive?
Yeah, I take the time to like maybe sit and watch a movie or a TV show or whatever and just kind of like turn my brain off for a little bit because my brain tends to never stop and it just gives me that chance to recuperate a little bit. And then I also every morning I wake up like even if it's an early morning, I wake up extra early so that I can sit at my desk and answer my emails while drinking coffee and maybe listening to music, like whatever score I'm obsessed with at the moment. And it sort of just like gives me this time to prepare for my day and that ability to calm myself.
I think I found like being intentional with routines and like
Mm-hmm.
finding ways to like rest even just a little bit throughout the at the beginning of the day or at lunch or during intermission. There's so many little things you can incorporate throughout your day to help you take care of yourself. It
Totally.
doesn't always need to be like I took a week off or something. It can just be like little tiny things throughout your day.
Yeah. Well, and something that I also didn't used to do is I didn't used to take my breaks. I used to
Hmm.
maybe go to the bathroom for like the first 2 minutes and then I would come back and I would work through the rest of that 10. And I've learned that that's not productive for me because it doesn't give me a chance to step back and re energize. And
Mhm.
I also just need my breaks. Like, I just did a show where they were really bad about calling breaks. At one point, we went almost 4 hours without a break.
Oh,
And
oh
I,
my god.
I had to complain about it. I was like, this is not healthy for us, and this is not healthy for the actors. And I ended up just taking a break because I needed it. And, everyone
Mhm.
needed it.
I mean, at some point, it's like taking a break. Some maybe feels like a waste of time, but at some point, it's like you're losing time anyway because people are tired and
Exactly.
frustrated, and then all these arguments happen and nothing is getting done. Like
Yeah, the work suffers if we're not given adequate time to recuperate.
for sure. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, I don't know. I think another thing is that you don't have to know everything.
Hmm.
Um, the first year or so that I was here, I thought that it was a sign of weakness to ask questions, and I'm realizing that it's really not. And admitting, oh, that's not my strongest area. Can we do this together? Is really beneficial both to you and to the show because you might do something wrong and then have to redo it, and then everyone's angry, and it's just not a good time. And there's also tons of resources on the internet and in books and in people. So take advantage of those resources.
Besides asking people for help, what other ways Do you have like more specific ways that you grow as an artist and grow in your creativity?
Yeah, so actually, YouTube has a lot of resources when it comes to sound and software and everything. And then I recently just bought a course on Logic Pro X, which is the digital audio workstation that I use. I think it was like $30 from udemy.com, which is udemy.com. And basically, I'm good at Logic and everything, but it's really turned me on to a lot of new things that I just didn't know. So taking advantage of that sort of thing and reading books and listening to podcasts and just keeping my mind active, realizing that I don't have to know everything and that this field is constantly changing and I get to change with it.
That's a great attitude to have. Final question, advice to young sound designers who are either starting out in college or just finishing up and starting a career.
Reach out to people. Anytime a student wants to come hang out with me at tech, I'm totally open to that. And I found that a lot of the designer community is also really open to that. And it's a good way to meet people and see how other people design, and just keep your brain working. And I also highly recommend taking board hopping gigs at the beginning to pay the rent while you design smaller gigs, because that's really worked out for me.
Thanks so much for taking the time to do this, Megan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.